Okay, today we're going to have a longer video explaining the problems with stylometrics when attempting to use it to inform authorship discussions related to the Pauline corpus. I'm going to start out by talking about the Federalist Papers. We've talked about this in previous videos, but Mosteller and Wallace published this paper, and the attempt was to figure out whether the disputed letters in the Federalist Papers were written by Hamilton or Madison. Both had published lists attributing the letters to authors between Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, but there were some disagreements about the authorship of certain letters. So Mosteller and Wallace looked at the undisputed between the two lists, letters attributed to Hamilton and Madison, and they tried to identify specific discriminating features which would inform them about the authorship of the disputed letters. So I have a quote here from their paper. Quote, "The single best discriminator we have ever discovered is upon, whose rate is about 3 per thousand for Hamilton and about 1/6 per thousand for Madison." End quote. So the idea, of course, is that if one of the disputed letters has a rate usage of upon that is high, say 3.1 per thousand, well, then it's more likely written by Hamilton. And if upon is seldom used, then it's more likely written by Madison. And they had multiple of these discriminating features. However, to find the word upon is not obvious unless you knew ahead of time which letters were written by Madison and Hamilton that were undisputed. The word upon is not in the top 20 words from either author. It's actually 39th and 100, past 100, outside the top 100. And so this was not a discriminating feature that would be selected without the knowledge ahead of time of the undisputed letters. And we have good reason to trust that Hamilton and Madison have given accurate records about the undisputed letters. One, because they have firsthand knowledge of who wrote the letters. And two, because if anything, there was an incentive to disassociate from letters because both of these individuals ended up doing things in their political careers. Only one was president, which ran contrary to many of the things that were written down in the papers. And so, if anything, there is going to be a desire for both parties to disassociate from the controversial letters. So the fact that they agree on who wrote many of the letters is a very good indication that they are authentic outside of both parties, obviously having firsthand knowledge since they were the individuals who wrote it. So we have a good axiomatic foundation for trusting these attribution lists, and we also have a plausible reason for understanding why the lists differed. There's other factors too. Hamilton was going into a duel, and he gave the list to his lawyer. So you're probably under a bit of duress and stress, and you hastily created that list, etc., etc. But those are less or more minor confounding factors, in my opinion. So the slide you're looking at now is if we did not assume ahead of time that we knew which ones were written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. And if, instead of looking for those specific discriminating features, we looked at the 100 most frequent unigrams. And we put our hyperparameter K in this unsupervised clustering analysis using the Stylo tool, open source, our tool. We misidentify or misclassify 3 of the known letters. And so actually, as we broaden the scope of what style is defined as, we went from specific individual features to 100 most frequent words, we now have errors. And if we make our study a little bit more complex and we look at the 100 most frequent bigrams, meaning word pairs in this instance, well, now we have 12 misclassifications. And of course, a priori, if we were just looking at all these letters, we wouldn't know that there were only 3 authors. That's contingent on this fundamental historical knowledge of the situation. And so if we go back to our 100 most frequent unigrams used, and we said used a hyperparameter, meaning identify 5 clusters instead of the 3 clusters, which would make sense but we wouldn't know that ahead of time. Well, now we're approaching a 50% error rate among the known letters. So, what does this demonstrate? This demonstrates that choosing accurate stylistic indicators is dependent on known corpuses, because these discriminators these precise discriminators are what are very useful in differentiating authorship. It's actually very, very difficult to identify universal indications of style. And part of the reason is going to be demonstrated through these issues of Pauline stylometrics in this field, but are also addressed by the paper I published using an unsupervised machine learning analysis with principal component analysis to reduce our very, very large feature dimension space. So it's hard to choose accurate stylistic indicators. Basically, it's hard to define style mathematically that actually applies across time, space, language, and genre, all these other things we're going to talk about. And then, of course, ahead of time, you do not know the optimal model parameters. And we talked about the hyperparameter K. So we don't always know, looking at a corpus, how many authors are actually present in it. We talk about the 13 or 14 letters of Paul, whether you include Hebrews or not, as the Pauline corpus, but that could be one author, just Paul. It could be two authors. It could be 5 authors, 10 authors. If every letter was written by somebody different, it could be 14 authors. If the letters were written by multiple people, each one, it could be 28 authors. So that hyperparameter of not knowing how many individuals to include in these analyses, stylometrically of Paul's corpus, make this essentially an impossible study to conduct reliably. So another problem, another confounding factor with Pauline stylometrics is that authorial styles change over time. Paul's ministry may have spanned decades, and there have been studies done, for example, in this case, on English-speaking authors, where they looked at books written across an author's life, and they found that some specific stylometric measurements, like engrams, did change significantly over time. So these stylistic markers change within the author over time, and that might apply to Paul since his ministry spanned a long time. Mood, genre, rhetorical bent, the time spent taken to write something, these all affect style. Benjamin White, in his book Counting Paul, talks about word length distributions. Those pick up genre signals rather than author signals. I have a quote from Randolph Richards where he discusses that historically, some of these letters might have been written under haste to travel. There's also, of course, the prison literature in Paul. That tradition says these were written from prison. And so that definitely might have impacted the style of writing if those traditional descriptions are accurate. Paul also used aides or secretaries to write these letters, which is explicitly stated in Romans 16:22, implicitly noted in other of the verses. And if Paul did use secretaries and did not slowly dictate it, meaning say a word and the scribe writes it exactly how he said it, well, then it's very likely that the secretary could introduce a stylistic difference from Paul if Paul sat down and just wrote it himself. In studies of other corpuses, ones that were written by scribes, for example, are able to be identified by the letters written by the individuals themselves. Paul also lists co-senders. So how can we be certain that the co-senders had nothing to do with the style and content of the letters? For example, in the letters that are attributed to be co-authored with Timothy, those are the only ones where Paul uses a Thanksgiving formula. And then, of course, we'd have to ask, what is the convention in the first century for Greek, let's say, itinerant preachers in this case, or travelers? What's the convention for listing co-senders that had absolutely nothing to do with the composition of the work? The scribes might have corrupted the original or our preservation of the original manuscripts. So this is a big discussion, but typically it's around, can we trust the content of the letters because we don't have the original manuscripts. And I don't want to make that argument. Rather, I'd just like to say that in all of our copies of the Pauline letters, there are slight differences. I should say, probably not in all. I'm sure there's been perfect replications, but in the ones that we retain from the early Christian period, there are stylistic differences, small differences. And while these might not be theologically significant in a stylistic analysis, they could be significant. And of course, because we don't have the original manuscripts, we can't be certain that the earliest copies we do have, accurately preserved the stylistic composition of the manuscripts. Okay, and then there's also this point that Paul's theology could have just changed over time, and rational consistency wasn't a primary concern of apocalyptic Judaism. So here's a great quote from Dale Allison that Jesus did not celebrate rationality as a virtue. His tradition was not Greco-Roman philosophy, but popular Galilean Judaism. And Galilean Judaism had incongruous and inconsistent elements. If you look at the bottom, there's a quote from Menachem Kellner that systematic theology has two components: an attempt to establish clearly what ideas religion teaches, and an attempt to fit these into a consistent framework. And Judaism lacks both, especially ancient Judaism. So when we look at verses that we think might be contradictions, or let's just say contradictions, like 1 Thessalonians 4:15 and Philippians 1:23, even though these are both in the quote unquote undisputed corpus, ironically. In 1 Thessalonians 4:15, Paul says, "We who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will surely not precede those who have fallen asleep." So he's assuming he will be, or some of the people there, will be alive during the Parousia event when Jesus returns. And I would say, actually, Paul thinks he'll be there since he uses "we." And in Philippians 1:23, he says, "I long to depart this life and be with Christ, for that is far better." And we get this indication that perhaps Paul's thinking he might die prior to the second coming. Now, this could be a theological change over time. That's absolutely a possibility. But it also could just be that Paul somehow held these two events simultaneously, even if they are potentially rationally inconsistent when we approach this from our more Western stylogical tradition. And lastly, there's forgery concerns. So there's a lot of literature on this, but it is very, very difficult to identify forgeries. And this applies to even modern studies. So I'm not going to go over all of these, but in general, it's a 50-50 chance whether you're going to be able to identify whether a work is forged or not, even in the modern period. And this gets to the crux of the problem here, is we can't do supervised studies. Because if you assume ahead of time that some letters are authentic, and we just listed all the confounding problems related to saying that something is correct or incorrect, or this is genuinely Pauline or not, there is no way to know which letters are the authentic Pauline letters. People who say that the current 7-letter corpus is undisputed, that is not evidence. That's just an alleged consensus. All that matters is the evidence. And Jennifer Strawbridge has a database about the citations of the Pauline letters, and disputed letters like Ephesians and Colossians were cited more frequently than many of the undisputed letters. So we're actually arguing in modernity against our earliest historical references to these letters. And it's impossible to know which ones Paul actually wrote. We don't have the originals. We don't have people citing those letters until Clement of Rome, decades later. We don't have any eyewitnesses of Paul extant that attest to a letter being authentic. And we have no archaeological evidence that, obviously, because we don't have those first manuscripts, that any of these are Pauline. That might be discovered in the future. Maybe under the church in Corinth, there is one of the original letters from the first century. We'll find that. But currently, there's no way to know that any of these letters are authentic ahead of time. So when you just assume that some are authentic and create this framework for justifying that, you've just completely biased your study because you've already identified what's authentic in your mind and then using that as a basis against other letters. Often without a distractor corpus, which is necessary for providing context as to the results of your findings. And what can our mathematical model solve? Well, we've already talked about not knowing these stylistic indicators, not knowing optimal hyperparameters. I would say that the only thing really our mathematical models can help us with are going to be adjusting or taking into account the mood, genre, rhetorical bent by not just using those features which are very prone to, say, identify genre rather than authorship. And I would say that we can do something about the first century forgery concerns. And so to address what we can address, we would want to do an unsupervised machine learning algorithm. It's going to look at this in a hyperplane, use dimensionality reduction. And the idea here is we use a ton of features. We are not going to be using biased feature selection. If we don't assume that any of the letters are authentic ahead of time, then we accurately reflect the epistemological situation. And by looking in 1,000 plus feature dimension space and then using dimensionality reduction, I don't think any living person today can conceive of the world or any subject in 1,000 plus dimensions. And so an ancient forger would not be able to do all that math in his head and then identify the relationship of these variables to forge those relationships. So I think that that is a strong argument to use this method for authorship attribution clustering analysis. So that's some of the issues. I'm not going to go into my study in this video. I'll do it in another one. But that's a lot of the issues related to Pauline stylometrics. So when people make claims that X is stylistically different from Y related to Paul's letters, you should be very, very wary of those claims. And I argue it is impossible to know which of the letters are Pauline. And this is not principally a mathematical problem. This is principally a epistemological problem with historical dependencies.